Okay, ready to get underway. A very warm welcome to everyone to this second webinar for INTBAU's Architecture Challenge. My name is Harriet Wenberg and I'm Executive Director of INTBAU, a global network dedicated to creating better places to live. And so I'm joining today from Atlantic Canada, and all of you are joining from a very impressive list of more than 30 countries really all around the world and in many, many different time zones. So welcome to all of you joining on Zoom and also through the live stream. The INTBAU Architecture Challenge is a competition for low carbon, no carbon, and carbon negative designs for resilient and adaptable houses. The design competition of the initiative is going to launch alongside COP26, the UN Climate Conference, in November this year. Starting in July last month and continuing each month until next April, we're running an interactive series of webinars as part of the Architecture Challenge, because the Architecture Challenge is about both words and actions. So the webinar series is intended to help encourage thought and discussion, leading to greater knowledge and strong submissions to the design competition from participants who choose to enter. And so just to remind those of you who are thinking about entering the competition, we also want built tangible results from the Architecture Challenge, and we're looking for opportunities to be able to construct and to test winning designs in the context for which they're intended. So just before I move on to today's session and an introduction to that, I do want to pause just to thank our sponsors very much, our sponsors being Ali Reza and Mina Sagarchi and Stanhope Gate Architecture. So today's session, we're going to be focusing on just a small fraction of the extraordinary diversity of the world's building cultures and the role the knowledge held within them must play in a sustainable built future. For millennia now, our planet has played host to many hundreds of methods of building structures for people to live and meet in and around. So these methods have been adapted over generations, developing from local factors such as skills, materials, and climates. In 2021, where we are now, there is increasing recognition of the wisdom and the relevance embodied in vernacular, traditional, local, and indigenous methods of building, which work with rather than against nature. But you also can't really ignore the irony and tension created by the fact that this is an initiative for architects and architecture students, amongst others, and that vernacular architecture can be considered an architecture without architects. So this really hints at one of the difficult questions our speakers will have in mind today, and which will also be tackled in next month's, in September's Architecture Challenge webinar, specifically looking at difficult questions. So to the running order for the session today, I'm going to be introducing each speaker in turn, just with a very short bio. But there's more about each of them that you can find on the Architecture Challenge website, which is challenge.intbau.org, and we'll bring that up on a slide towards the end. We're also going to have a question and answer session to close today for the last sort of half hour. So type your questions, please, as we go in the Q&A box, or you can save them up to the end to when we get to that session. There's also the chat feature you'll know on Zoom webinar. Use that for greetings, other messages you want to send, but questions, please, in the Q&A box. So to move on now to our first pair of today's four speakers, we're going to have Ellen Buttrose joined by Angela Morton. So Ellen is an architect based in Queensland, Australia, working with people-oriented design. She also sits on the Sustainability Committee of the Queensland chapter of the Australian Institute of Architects, and last year received the Emerging Architecture Prize for Queensland State. Angela Morton, joining Ellen, also works with people-oriented design and recently completed her master's dissertation on the self-built bush kitchens of her family and community in Port Vila, Vanuatu. So Ellen and Angela, let's have you coming on to video so we can see you, and very kindly joining us from Queensland at 4 minutes past midnight, which is very, very kind of you, as Friday becomes Saturday. So over to you to speak to us and talk us through your slides.
Thank you for having us, INTBAU. We're very pleased to be here, albeit very late. And just want to say before we get started, if we do have any kind of tongue twisters this evening, we are running off the end of a busy week and straight into the depths of Friday evening. So I'll share my screen now. Just around to that. First of all, we'll start with an acknowledgement of the country we are on, which is Gimoy, Wallabarri, Dingy country, and to all of the countries that we're speaking to tonight across Australia and in fact the world, and the traditional owners and custodians, both present, emerging, and past, and their knowledge that they have and generously share in helping us all to build a great future together. So we are people-oriented design. We're a small architecture practice based in the deep north of far north Queensland, at the top end of Australia's tropics. We work here in Cairns, but we work right across the top end of Australia. Our closest capital city, in fact, is Port Moresby in Papua New Guinea, and we are profoundly affected by climate, as well as spanning through different language groups across Australia. There are over 500 different language groups in Australia, of Australia's First Nations people, each with their own language, history, cultural practice, religion, and traditions.
So because of this, there is a wide variety of First Nations ethno-architecture in Australia that are specific to the local materials available, their response to climate, and their relation to country. So pictured here, for example, are just the typologies of Arnhem Land people located in the top end of Northern Territory. So these structures also hold ancestral histories and are connected to spirituality, religion, and law. So they go beyond just well-designed, passive designed climatic structures. So here is an example of traditional dome structures that were once located not far from here on Yidinji country. So colonial impacts on Australia has meant a lot of traditional knowledge has been disrupted or displaced and unfortunately lost. I guess an alternative narrative that's a similar, it's a similar narrative in terms of Indigenous people being colonized, and so their traditional methods and ways of building and living is discontinued or fragmented or disrupted in some way. These are just some slight sketches and slight analysis that I undertook as part of my thesis. So in Vernacular, thatched roofing made out of nathangora, which is different types of bamboo and thatched grass, and woven bamboo walls are still continue today and have been integrated into Western building materials. So there's this morphing of traditional building methods with, I guess, Western methods of building and with Western materials. So bush kitchens and nakamals, so these are men's houses, and gendered spaces are still practiced in Vanuatu today. And this is an example of a nakamal located in Port Vila town, so it's quite an urban setting, and so these structures have adapted and evolved, and I guess shown their versatility to be able to make space for themselves in that urban setting.
Returning to Australia, our traditional knowledge holders who we still have in Australia become even more important, and their stories hold even greater weight when we hear from them, and who are still connected to traditional practice across Australia. So here is Uncle Peter Wallace and Auntie Marilyn Wallace on their country, Kuku-Yalanji country, just north of Cairns, where we have students from the University of Queensland learning firsthand about their tradition. And here is Uncle Peter Hyde. He's a Gimwe Wallabari Yidinji elder, traditional owner, mentor, and dear friend. He is a man who has been a great influence to us here in Cairns and at Pod. He has so generously taught us a lot about his own traditional knowledge. He grew up in the 70s in a mission just close to Cairns, and often takes us walking on country. And here he is with strips of bukal or yokal, ready for some lumber building for Shanine. Here is a snip that he would have loved to have shown tonight of his uncles, or his father and his uncle in Yarrabah, not far from here, and traditional shields. He often is painting his own traditional shields, continuing this tradition today. So I guess an example of how we work with Uncle Peter is this is Girrawande or White Rock, just south of Cairns, which is a suburban setting, perhaps a little less dense than London streets, but still an urban setting just found just south of Cairns. We walked this with Uncle Peter after we were given a project by our local council here, and in my Western eyes, I see this as a greenfield site. Uncle Peter then told us, generously shared, as in a consulting role, knowledge that he had about that site, which was that there was a significant waterway that used to run through there that held particular ochres used for birthing and healing on that particular site. So working with him involved unearthing, well, bringing to light these traditions, or a significance of this space that would have otherwise gone unnoticed in the proposal that we put forward for this project.
So this is another project which Pod has been involved in and just recently finished construction. So it's the Girrawande Yalamaka Health Clinic Wellbeing in Yarrabah. So this is in the Ganji country. Did you want to?
Yeah, yep. So this project was really significant for Potters of Practice and also for Girrawande Yalamaka, because it is an Aboriginal run, owned and operated health clinic. And from the outset, the steering committee were very committed to having Indigenous involvement the entire way through, which led to an incredibly successful process and outcome. So we had a number of elders share their stories at the beginning of the project, which involved both a Guyala, the local protector and hawk that is found in that region, and a healing water story that is pertinent to Yarrabah, that was then translated into a number of elements within the building.
Yeah, so this here is the sketch you see on the right was is by Philomena Gateman, a local and revered elder and artist of Yarrabah. So we're commissioned her to be involved in the design process, and this is a story which she put forward, which is very significant to the area. So this story of this healing waters. So that was incorporated into the designing of upholstery fabric, screening fabric, and so forth.
Here again, we have Uncle Peter and Auntie Philomena at the Yarrabah Art Centre, where Philomena is making her beautiful fabrics. This water story also continued because we had such generosity right from the outset of this project. It meant that these stories could really be embedded into the planning as well as the model of care. This idea of healing water really ended up being expressed from the front door right the way through to the yarning circle at the back of the space, at the back of the building. And it really created these really generous volumes that Uncle Peter says he doesn't even need to go into the building. He stands out the front and is healed.
We had local rangers involved as well in selecting landscape, and there were some species which were gifted to the project as well by the rangers. So all in all, there was a lot of Indigenous elders, artists and community involved in the project from the beginning right through the end, and 95% involvement of, when you consider the contractor, the tradies, trying to ensure that the financial gain is going back into the community as well. And I guess this is all kind of part of the bigger picture of designing, I guess, modern day, in quotation marks, Aboriginal architecture is ensuring that First Nations, Indigenous people are involved.
Right from the start to the end. Which Alison Page so eloquently puts, Indigenous architecture is not a style, but a culturally appropriate process based on communication, trust, and community development. From the moment a building idea is conceived to the moment it is realised, communication in whatever form and community involvement will determine the Aboriginality of the architecture. And here is a shot that we took last week walking on country with Uncle Peter Hyde. And as he'd say, Cully, thank you.
Cully.
Thank you for having us.
Cully, to you both. Wonderful. No twisted tongues whatsoever, despite the late hours. So thank you very much to Ellen and to Angela. Really interesting, example of design practice, really working hand in hand with community from Queensland, Australia. Thank you. We'll come now on to our second speaker, Marcel Belinga. And Marcel is Professor of Anthropology of Architecture at Oxford Brookes University in the UK. He's also Editor-in-Chief of the second edition of the Encyclopedia of Vernacular Architecture of the World, which is to be published next year. Marcel, over to you. We'll get your slides up.
Thank you very much, Harriet, and Juliet and INTBAU, of course, for the invitation to speak here today. And more importantly, of course, for taking the initiative to design the Architecture Challenge competition, which is so much needed in today's world and is in fact, I think, long overdue. Can I have the first slide, please? I can't see if the slide is there.
Just coming. There we go.
Okay, yeah, great. Thank you. Yeah, so the world is overheated, to borrow the anthropologist Thomas Erikson's term. It is full, it is fast, and it is facing an overwhelming range of challenges, including climate change, conflict, population growth, and ecological destruction. These challenges and architecture's involvement in them have, of course, already been discussed in the first session, and they will no doubt be discussed at later sessions too. So I will not dwell on that context here today. Can you have the next slide, please? What I would like to talk about today is how vernacular, traditional, local, and indigenous architecture may play a role in architecture's attempt to somehow make a difference in all this. Now, the first thing to say, I think, is that the four terms, though often used together or interchangeably, as indeed they are here, are in fact very different. They do not refer to the same things. They are also, each and every one of them, very difficult, if not impossible to define. And they come with connotations that are not always helpful and that indeed can be rather uncomfortable. I do not have time to go into this issue of semantics here, but I wanted to mention it as it is important to bear in mind, seeing that the connotations of each of these terms influence the way we respond to them, and thus also influence any attempt to design with them in mind. Now, for convenience, I will use today the term traditional architecture in reference to all these four concepts. But please note the importance of the semantic differences. Can I have the next slide, please? Learning from traditional architecture is not a new thing. Again, I have no time to delve into the history here, but the idea that we can learn from traditional forms of architecture has been central to architecture ever since it became self-conscious. The lessons to be learned ranged from safeguarding regional identities in the 19th century, think of the arts and crafts movement, to designing for a new world, the modernist movement at the early 20th century. From exposing the self-righteousness of the profession, Bernard Rudowski in the 1960s and his famous Architecture Without Architects exhibition, to addressing the global housing need, Paul Oliver in 1987, UN's Year of the Homeless. Most recently, sustainability is at the top of the agenda, as this event here today shows. Next slide, please. So here we are, after all these years and these centuries of asking the same questions and making the same claim, that there is something to be learned from traditional forms of architecture. Two questions can be asked at this point, I think. First, what have we learned? And second, if we have learned any lessons, why do we have to keep on making this claim? Have we not learned anything after all? For the sake of argument, I would like to propose 4 lessons that I think can be learned. If they come across as provocative, that is because I hope they can start a debate. I will then try to begin to answer the second, perhaps more difficult question. Next slide, please. Paradoxically, perhaps, the first lesson that the study of traditional architecture teaches us is that such architecture does not really exist. Traditional architecture is the architecture of the other. It is a concept that has been called into existence to help define and validate the architectural canon. That is, architecture with a capital A. While the concept is helpful to identify, define, and represent a truly enormous range of architectural forms that have conventionally fallen outside of this canon, in emphasizing their otherness, it does not actually increase our understanding of the design, use, and meaning of the architecture concerned. To quote Paul Oliver, there is no such thing as traditional architecture. There is only architecture that embodies traditions. Next slide, please. Now, related to this, the second lesson, I think, is that these traditions are dynamic, ever-changing, creative processes through which people, as active agents, negotiate, interpret, and adapt knowledge and experiences gained in the past within the context of the challenges, wishes, and requirements of the present. Tradition is not a bounded, depersonalized, and unchanging body of knowledge, forms, customs, or values that is handed down from generation to generation, ready to be used. It is instead a process that requires the active involvement of people who will need to actively discover, learn, apply, and adapt its contents in a process of continuous becoming. Tradition, therefore, does not hold lessons in the form of tried and tested tips and tricks, ready to be used and applied to contemporary problems. As convenient and appealing as that would be, it requires serious engagement. Next slide, please. Now, thirdly, as traditions are dynamic, the architecture that embodies them is never static either, but always changing and in a continuous state of becoming, just as much as the people who design, make, and dwell in, at, on, or about it. Or, in fact, just as the environment that encompasses both. As the anthropologist Tim Ingold has shown, architecture is not fixed, but processual and relational, like the materials it is made of and the people that create and inhabit it. As part of this continuous process of becoming, architectural traditions appear, they merge, they amalgamate, they change, they move and disappear as human values, beliefs, habits, and customs alter, and the environment that encompasses it all itself changes in a continuous process of becoming. What worked architecturally in the past may consequently not function in the present, if, for instance, ways of life or environments have changed. Next slide, please. Now, a fourth lesson I think we can learn is that the result of all these changes in environment, culture, knowledge, and tradition is the huge diversity of ways of designing, making, and dwelling. And I define dwelling here once more, following Paul Oliver, as the process of living in, or at, or on, or about a place. It's this huge diversity that has made up and continues to make up the world's architecture. It is this diversity which in itself is ever changing, and the way in which it is a repository of different ontologies and worldviews, of different ways of engaging with the natural environment and with one another, and of different ways of inhabiting space, of building, and of giving meaning. It is this diversity that provides the real lesson of traditional architecture, that there is not one form of architecture that is better, more interesting, more appropriate, more advanced, more true, more local, or more sustainable than another. Next slide, please. So far then, for the lessons that we can learn from traditional architecture. Designing with them in mind requires engaging with traditions in a creative and critical manner, recognizing their merits and limitations, their ever-changing and inevitably hybrid nature, and not being afraid of adopting traditions if they appear different, nor of adapting traditions if they no longer work. This, I think, is the challenge for everyone that will be taking part in this particular INTBAU challenge. Next slide, please. Now, the second question I posed, why do we have to keep on making this claim that we can learn from tradition? Have we not learned anything after all? I think is more difficult to answer and requires more thought and discussion. And hopefully sessions such as these can start those discussions. As a start, the answer, I think, is to be found in the narrow way in which architecture continues to be defined. That is architecture with a capital A. In the lack of inclusivity of the profession, in the parochial scope and focus of the educational curricula defined by professional bodies, and in the general lack of education around cultural diversity, cultural interaction, and cultural change. I think that it is only when we no longer need to distinguish traditional, vernacular, local, or indigenous architecture from architecture as such that we will be in a position to start addressing the challenges that we face. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Marcel. Wonderful to be reminded of the Paul Oliver quote, there is no traditional architecture, there is only architecture that embodies traditions. So thank you certainly for that, but also just for really making the point so clearly of the active process and the continuous becoming that, that traditions and all manner of other sort of precedent forms within architecture embody. So to those participating in the challenge, as you say, there are no ready-made solutions. It won't be possible to find an answer to this architecture challenge already out there and ready to be replicated exactly. It takes active engagement, adaptation, and bringing on. Thank you, Marcel, very much. We'll come to our third speaker, Angela Calvo Garcia. And Angela has worked closely with INTBAU's chapter in Spain for a number of years on the creation of a national directory of craftspeople for the entirety of Spain. Angela is also involved in Terrachidia, which is an NGO working with local masters, communities, and international participants on the earth architecture of the Mohammed Oasis in southern Morocco. And just also to point out with congratulations that Terrachidia recently earned a Philippe Rotier Prize for the reconstruction and enhancement of local heritage. So congratulations for that, Angela, and looking forward to hearing from you now. So we'll get your
Thank you so much. Thank you so much on behalf of the whole team of Terrachidia. Well, I'm going to start sharing my slides. I think here. There we go. Okay. Well, if you don't know it, Terrachidia is an NGO that contributes to the development of sustainable communities through heritage conservation and rehabilitation. We are all architects in the team, so we are specialized in this field, but we understand heritage in a very holistic way. In this path, global challenges push us and all our field of work to find solutions. And we, as all the panelists in this gathering today, are looking into tradition. And what we have found is resilience. Resilience is a word that we can hear everywhere nowadays, but what does it really mean? It means an ability and a way to look life, willing to adapt oneself when you are confronted with a disturbing agent or a difficult situation. And this man, it pictures exactly this concept. He understands his environment, he has learned from it, and that's why he wears a scarf to protect himself from the sun. He's bound to his socio-cultural context and his clothes say so. And he's also creative. He's not stuck in the past. He continuously adapts and is using new tools for new challenges. Where have we found resilience? Well, this adaptability is found in the most hostile climates, and those are the deserts. And here you can see a map of numerous oases, which are an intelligent and response to these hostile climates that we can find in the north of Africa and the Arabian Peninsula. As I was saying, oases are intelligent responses to the most hostile conditions, but they are anthropic landscapes. They challenge climate change and they challenge destructive human act. Live in a fragile equilibrium based on an enormous amount of knowledge of the place, knowledge of the assets that that place gives, and the knowledge of how to invent ways to adapt, change, and protect oneself from those dangers that you find. The oasis is an environment that it's organized in 3 layers. The ground layers, it's basically crops, it's vegetables to feed both people and animals that live in the place. The second layer is a middle scale, it's fruit trees, and the third layer is a canopy layer that it's mainly palm trees. As you can see here, it's always in the landscape of the oasis is an identity symbol. And what is most important is that it is a key element capable of generating a microclimate and the conditions favorable to the fragile, to make it exist, the fragile oasis ecosystem. Where have we decided, or where have we found a place to work on these conditions? Well, this is the Mohammed Oasis. In this picture, you can see what oasis really stand for in a territorial scale. It's just a green stripe, a green line. This is a picture of the Dra Valley in the south of Morocco, where Terratidia works since 2012. More specifically, what you see is a chain of 6 oases along 200 kilometers in length, and approximately 23,000 people, and mostly from rural origin. I'm talking about 84 or 85% of the population is from rural origin. And the last one, the last dot of this green chain is the Mohammed Oasis. And what can you find there? Well, you can find an immense and overwhelming landscape. You can find brave and intelligent people who are continuously adapting to this space. You can find the oasis, and here you can see perfectly these 3 layers that I was talking about and the beauty of it. And you can find the kasur, the traditional villages where all these people live. Well, Mohammed, looking closer now, is from that green dot we were seeing at the big plan, big scale. It changes into a cluster of 12 kasur or fortified villages scattered along the oasis gardens and orchards, and a new urban center that grows alongside the main road. This new urban center holds 3,000 of the nearly 8,000 population of the whole oasis, so nearly half of it. What you have seen, the oasis and the kasar, are both 2 elements of two sides of the same coin. They have an interdependent relation. They cannot exist one without the other. One of the main problems that it's facing now is the scarcity of water that is leading to agriculture not being a way of living anymore, an economic way of living, sorry. It's just a way of subsistence, and that goes along with the global challenges: rural depopulation, abandonment of the fields, and the advance of the desert. Because all these fields that we are seeing are just a barrier, a green barrier for the desert. When we go to the urban scale, even if it's really small, we can see the second half of this coin, the second side. It's a really balanced system. A kasar is a fortified village that congregates a whole range of bioclimatic design strategies. It has a structure of fishbone shaped, with one main street that connects one gate, here you can see it, to the other, sorry. you can follow a line and connect them both. It's a main street that has 2.5 meters wide, so you can imagine, you can have an idea with a picture here. And from this one, appear the secondary streets. These are semi-covered alleys, partially private, that give access to the different houses. These spaces, even they can look like simple, they are not. They are solving all the problems that this arid climate presents. Shades, focal light, and focal points of light, very strategic and very poetic too, I have to say. And it protects also from the wind. You can see here the secondary streets. The gates and the streets are turned, so they protect from the main winds to penetrate the streets. And of course, these places, the gates, become so forth the really good gathering spaces. When you pass on to domestic spaces from one of these doors, then you can see the patio, which becomes the real facade of the houses. Well, all the decoration is held. And well, the patio also responds to really important biochromatic questions. The courtyard, sorry, I'm using the Spanish word. Well, it solves the question of lighting. It enters light to all the spaces of the house and also serves as ventilation using the Bernoulli effect. The different spaces, how are they used? Well, here you can see two examples, but it's important to know that all the spaces are adaptable. They do not have a specific use, they change. And for example, the terrace is a very important part also, because during the year, the women gather there and do their jobs. And then in the summer nights, all the family sleeps there. Then we pass on to how this construction are part of a landscape. That's because there is a constructive culture that is still alive, and it's constructed of rammed earth, which is the main constructive technique that you can find. And you can find also very, very impressive tall structures, as this tower of Regavi. The other construction techniques is adobe and also earth renderings, of course. As you can see, the material of the place becomes the houses and all makes one. The other materials that are used are tamarind wood, palm tree wood for beams and structures, also roofing, and of course canes for roofing and also for the floors. Constructive culture, I'm talking about something that is alive. As we were saying before, tradition is something that changes with time, but it is now confronting a contrast, a really big contrast. As you can see here, this is the new mosque built by the government, the local government. It is, of course, made in concrete. This is the new model. The new model follows one street instead of a cluster like of a fortified and protected space. It follows one line, and it of course gives more services to the people, which is one problem that is needed to be addressed, but at the same time gives many more problems that were already solved with the traditional houses. And the problem now is that most of the people see the old villages as a symbol of poverty instead of a symbol of knowledge and tradition and inherited. So we are facing this desertification and depopulation, and it looks like this. And what are we doing there? Well, we are proposing a new model. We are proposing to give value to vernacular heritage, to work with locals and also with international groups in order to share knowledge. Here you can see another working area in Talha and Mohammed, one of the Kasur. As you see, sustainable development again through heritage conservation and rehabilitation. This is the Ouled Youssef the Morabit. It's a marabut. It's a place where an old man is buried, and everyone goes there and gathers there. We thought it was a very important place to rehabilitate, but it was not coming from us. It was something that the people of Ouled Youssef asked for. They knew it was an important place for them, and there's where we worked. Here you can see both teams, local and international, working together, raising awareness, educating both sides of the team, and giving value to the heritage. We, of course, as I was saying, think that cooperation goes both ways, and we give what we know, and we also know that receive really, really much more sometimes. And in our purpose of keeping tradition alive, we contribute to equal opportunities for women, preparing crafts workshops with them, learning from them. And also we secure basic habitability with projects of sewerage and drainage. And documentation. We are learning from a place, so we have to share it. We have to share it like we are doing today. We've published various publications of Mohammed Oasis, also Chingeti in Mauritania. You can find them on our website. And we are looking forward to the new projects. As Harriet was saying before, we have received a very important prize recently, and we are looking forward to start this workshop school and construction and crafts with local and international works for the rehabilitation of the Great Mohammed Mosque. So again, resilience, getting to know the environment, learning from tradition, and always embracing creativity. Thank you very much.
Angela, thank you. No, it's wonderful, and coming on from Marcel perfectly, that bringing us into the Dra Valley, and again just discussing this concept of adapting and the active processes that are behind resilience, and looking at what can be learned from a local place, what can be then applied from that other parts around the world, how can those traditions be seen for what they are and adapted and brought on. Thank you very, very much. And I'd urge everybody maybe who's watching this, there will be more workshops, as Angela's saying, to happen in the Mohammed Oasis.
I don't know exactly when, but they are coming up.
They're coming up, so we can all look forward to those, but to go and to see for yourselves. I think there's much that can be done through a screen, and we're all extremely fortunate, obviously, the silver lining of these last months, that we can be connected and travel virtually without the carbon of actual travel. But the chance to be hands-on at one of those workshops, a very good thing. And as a next best also, there's an excellent film that was done in collaboration with the Archean program at the University of Liverpool. And I think we have, I know, one or two professors from there on the session today. So we'll make sure that link's available to everybody on here, so you can see even more of what Angela's just brought to life through her slides. Thank you. That brings us to our final and fourth speaker for this session, Manali Nanavati. Manali is an architect and graduate of CEPT University in Ahmedabad, India, as well as of Oxford Brookes in the UK. Her work so far, both in practice and research, has focused on architecture as a tool for the holistic development of an area or region and its community. And Manali is currently working on a research project at the Indian Institute of Technology, Bombay. Manali, welcome, and over to you.
Thank you very much, Harriet, and Juliet too. Hello, everyone. Just like all of you, I have also been building my journey as an architect in a way that I can contribute something meaningful. And today I'll be sharing some of my own learning from my studies of vernacular, local, and indigenous architecture of some places in India, which I hope will help you in the design challenge. Yeah, next slide, please. So to start with, what I've realized is that man has always attempted to find ways of living with his climate and has developed a culture in harmony with the same. In this process, he has developed certain dependencies, certain relationships with the elements of nature, with people, with animals, birds, trees, sun, rains, and other things, developing specific patterns of co-living. Diverse geographical conditions and different cultures have given birth to numerous examples of co-living, each creating a different environment. The indigenous architectural solution generally responds to these equations. Since Marcel is here, I must mention that I'm not differentiating between vernacular, local, and indigenous here, just for the ease of understanding. Sorry, Marcel. Yeah, next slide, please. So for instance, this is an example which had marked the beginning of my work in this area. Banni region is a grassland in the middle of the desert of Kutch in Western India. Being a low-lying area, this region used to remain green throughout the year, serving as an anchor for the nomadic pastoralist communities. Next, please. Over a period of time, these nomadic communities started settling down there. The living pattern of these communities is built on living with minimum resources. Cattle are treated as family members, and milk used to be their main income source. Bright and colorful clothing and accessories were part of their culture to contradict the dry and monotonous, harsh landscape of the desert. These communities have developed their peculiar ways of living in this harsh place through generations. For example, the image in the bottom right, it shows their way of getting underground water from the uppermost strata of the salty land. The reason being that the uppermost strata of Banni is made of clay, and hence the well here is made shallow and porous with logs to draw water from the side and not from the bottom. Each family's well is also connected to a wider place from where their cattle can drink water. Next, please. The architecture takes shape in response to these relationships. These cylindrical units are made of mud and bear a conical thatch roof. Inside, houses are decorated with colorful traditional furniture. A house is made by an introvert arrangement of few of these units placed around the center. The place for cows and buffaloes of the family is made as one such rectangular semi-open unit. A high plinth raised above the flood levels acts as the connecting element for these units. This plinth also acts as an outdoor room for majority routine and social activities. Next, please. A cluster is formed by coming together of the plinths of one extended family. The family plans the plinth keeping in mind the future extension of the family. So as the family grows, they keep adding new units in the direction where the plinth is extended. Next, please. The settlement pattern shows one more territory demarcation after the cluster of plinths, like a fence, as you can see here. These are made with dry branches of the local trees for the cattle. All the clusters are generally placed around or nearby a natural depression where they find the possibility to construct the underground water source. Next, please. Thus, architecture at any scale takes shape in response to the ecological, climatic, social, cultural relationships. It takes shape in response to the parameters of that specific context. By context, I mean social, cultural, ecological, economic, climatic, encompassing all the parameters that form a contextual setting. The architectural response is peculiar to this context. Any change in one parameter or even any change in the cultural relationship with the same parameter gives shape to a new architectural solution. We can understand this point through some more examples. Next, please. This is an example of the habitat of another nomadic pastoral community settled in the hilly region of Rajasthan. This is a documentation project we had carried out under the related study program at CEPT University. And as you can observe, there are some similarities. The pattern of living with minimum resources is getting reflected. Relationship with the cattle, the overall spatial organization, use of central open space, place for the cattle, etc. are quite similar. Next, please. But there are some differences too. The houses are made of locally available material, stone and wood. The form, construction details, etc. are therefore different. As this nomadic community is different from the one in Banni, our previous example, the organization of interior spaces is also different. Next, please. The settlement pattern also shows changes as the relationship with land, water, flora, and fauna changes. As you can see, the houses follow the topography and are located based on the possibility of flat land. Water is easily available here, hence groundwater doesn't remain important. The relationship with land and the relationship with neighbors is different because the culture is different. Hence, any binding element like plinth is replaced by a clear territory demarcation through parapet walls. Next, please. Talking about the relationship with land and water, this is another example of a very different context. Aleppi in Kerala, in South India, where the sea enters land as backwater canals. These houses on backwaters stand as independent units, historically each acting as self-sufficient unit in terms of fruit, vegetables, transport, and social territories. They do have occasional interactions, sharing, and even dependence on common facilities. But these are more functional rather than social. A cluster takes shape in a very different manner here. Next, please. Next, please. Yeah, this is just to give you a hint of how the inhabitants of this place have a very different relationship with their environment than what we saw earlier. Next, please. Now, this is another comparable example of Majuli in Assam, the eastern part of India. A settlement located on the water edge, but having a very different architecture. Next, please. In this case, the settlement is located on a river edge on the floodplain. Hence, the houses are built on stilts. Functional and social spaces take shape in a different way and a different kind of environment is formed. Locally available material, bamboo, is used for construction. Next, please. As you can see, the houses here have a clear cluster pattern compared to the pattern in Aleppi. A cluster again is formed mainly by the houses of extended families. The farms and the grazing lands also can be clearly observed here. Next, please. A very different relationship with water is seen in the case of the urban areas of Ahmedabad, Gujarat, the western part of India. The houses reveal a linear organization with shared walls and a courtyard in the center to take the sunlight. This courtyard also helps in the traditional system of rainwater harvesting, through which water is stored in an underground tank. Each house used to store its own water in this manner. The streets also have some pockets of social spaces, and often the social pockets in between 2 or 3 clusters have the bird feeder structures, as shown in the top left image. Usually, this area also has provision of water and shady trees for the cattle of the community. Next, please. Thus, as the natural parameters and the relationship of the communities with them change in different peoples and places, the resultant architecture also shows variety. This is how we observe a large range of regional diversity in vernacular architecture. However, it is important to mention that this diversity is not imposed. It is not even irrational. It comes out of the peculiar architectural responses that are found to be appropriate for that context. The regional diversity is a byproduct of the process of creating appropriate architecture. And if we want to retain it, it will be retained by following the same approach of finding context-specific solutions. It cannot be retained by retaining the outer aesthetics, because that will only produce more museum towns. The same form that was achieved in the past might not fulfill the requirements of today. To address the necessities of today, we will have to reinterpret those indigenous principles and find solutions that are appropriate today. Next, please. Now, in such cases of architecture without architect, the term that is more commonly used, it is found that generally the design solutions were found through experiments and trials, and the best fit solutions were accepted. In that case, what happens when the necessities and living patterns change from family to family? What happens when cultural behaviors show some difference between 2 communities of the same settlement? Next, please. We can understand through the example of documentation of villages in Kulu Valley in the northern part of India. The houses are made of stone and wood. They are generally multi-storied with ground floor provided for the cattle and human habitation seen on the upper floors. Next, please. The use of space changes here with seasons, unlike the previous example. In the summer, they prefer to use the peripheral area more to work in the sun, while in the winter, the central core remains the center for all activities. The kitchen is planned in the in-between floor, and the heat is taken to the floor above through the chimney. This keeps both the upper floors warmer and more comfortable. Next, please. When more dwellings in the settlement are documented, one can clearly see how many variations of the same typology exist in the settlement. The section above shows a dwelling with an additional floor and a slightly larger span that allows an elaborate division of spaces. The in-between wall balcony on the upper floor on one side and 2 floors on the other are also seen. The section below shows another variation where the dwelling is made of 2 rows of spaces instead of 1. And the element of balcony or covered deck is planned only on one side. Next, please. Many long units were also found with a linear repetition of the same base unit, forming a house for a real big family of many members. The elements of their grammar remain same. Next, please. The details, in fact, are found to be same in all the variations. The wall section, the construction method, materials, elements, all remain same. Next, please. Thus, a basic DNA is found which allows flexibility as well as growth to adapt to different set of requirements and offers many variations. All the variations follow the same DNA. Next, please. A settlement is formed by all such variations of the same genetic DNA coming together. Next, please. And this is just to show how the same elements following the same DNA, but organized in a more complex manner, form a typology of temple complex. Next, please. In terms of time too, as necessities kept changing, the solutions kept developing accordingly. However, each change in architectural solution came in response to the change in tradition, culture, economy, climate, or ecological forces. Therefore, architecture is still found to be appropriate and peculiar in those examples. In none of these examples, architecture came first and then life had to adjust to it. On the contrary, life came first and architecture facilitated it. When we started putting architecture first, it started becoming inflexible for the life to take its own shape. And the thing is that behavior pattern, necessities, tradition, culture are not always constant. They keep changing with time, and accordingly, the design needs to change too in response. Hence, design needs to become responsive. And what I'm realizing more and more is that it is only a responsive design that sustains the test of time. Next, please. When I say responsive, I mean two things. Design being responsive to the contextual settings and design being flexible enough to remain responsive to the contextual settings even when these settings change. This aspect of flexibility is also an important one. Life of a design, life of a built environment has come in a slightly questionable zone due to the events such as climate change, fast changing culture, lack of resources, etc. Our designs are failing to respond to these situations. When we are spending so much energy, so many resources to achieve our climatic comfort levels in the design, it means that our design is not efficient enough. If we have to stop the cycle, then we will have to change our design in response to the climate change. And we will have to strategically plan our design in a way that it can help reducing or countering the climate change. The design will have to help in balancing the imbalanced system. Next, please. The potential of design will have to be understood in this reference. When we say that design responds to the local cultural and climatic conditions, we are saying that design responds to these interdependent relationships between men and all elements of nature. Now, these equations are not always balanced. Sometimes they are finely balanced, but often they are not. So if design can be looked at as a tool that can help achieving the balance, it can genuinely contribute something important. If a design solution can stabilize these interdependent relationships and make the cycle self-sustained, it can lead to not only a sustainable design solution, but also a sustainable way of life. For that, it is critical to recognize design as a powerful tool that can affect these relationships. It can join the broken links and can also bring required changes in the system. Next, please. In order to achieve this, these are the key learnings we will have to follow as designers. First, we will have to change the common trend of design thinking, which is where architecture comes first and then the life has to adjust to it. We will have to reverse the trend and understand all the dimensions of living patterns first and derive our architecture from it. Second, the design solution should be responsive to the particular contextual settings. The indigenous knowledge should be creatively adapted for the present and future requirements of the context and sensitively intervene to bring a meaningful change. Third, design should be seen as a powerful tool that can make valuable difference in the human nature relationship and can lead to sustainable ways of life. I'll end with 3 examples of these 3 points. Next, please. This one is of Yasmin Lari's work. You have heard her in the last session, so I'm not going into the details. The point I want to make here is how she intervenes, how she brings change into the traditional form, and how she actually brings change into the social norms, how she empowers women by providing a different place for the kitchen and by changing the process of construction. Next, please. How the community is then set free to have their sense of ownership and their sense of personalization in the spaces. Next, please. This is the work of Peter Rich from South Africa. The work shows how he first understands the cultural traditions, ritual associations of the place and people he is designing for, and then not translate, but interprets them to address their contemporary needs and challenges. Next, please. This is an example of an institutional building designed bang in the middle of a slum area, and the design is kept bold, but left perforated and open-ended to give scope to changes. And the community now feel the sense of ownership, feel the sense of familiarity because of the language of the architecture. Next, please. And the last is the example of a summer studio for the undergraduate students I had taken with a friend of mine. Our attempt here was to reverse the design thinking, as I said. First, understand how life operates, and then emerge from that. Next, please. Yeah, next, please. The students were made to get into the details of stories of the life of characters of a neighborhood, their cultural behaviors, aspirations, relationship with other neighborhood, with natural elements, etc. Everything was studied. And then they had to imagine how these things manifest in a spatial dimension. Next, please. So this was the original housing, which existed at the present site that we have selected. And after going through the entire exercise, the students could come up with a meaningful transformation of this composition with a much richer built environment. Next, please. Yeah, these are some pictures of the part of the street that they have developed. Next, please. Yeah. I'll end here by saying that just by changing the way we design, the entire housing can transform. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Manali, for taking us really around India and giving us some insight into the research and the really close looking that you've done already to help build an appreciation and also an understanding. And I know so many of your drawings through on those slides as well. I know that drawing is an important tool for you in understanding. And a good reminder and a call to action for those that are taking part in these sessions, but also in the design competition, of what a powerful tool design is, as Manali says, that to think about it as something that needs to be holistic. And the very good point that Manali made, our buildings embody really how we live, and that life came first. But we've got many places around the world now where possibly our ways of life aren't entirely sustainable. So the wrappers for those that are built are also probably not sustainable, or in cases where architecture is coming first and life is needing to adapt to fit that and not the other way around. So these aren't easy questions to answer, but obviously we're a good group on here and taking part in this and other initiatives. So we will get somewhere with these. Thank you, Manali, very much. That brings our spoken sessions to a close for today, but we're now going to move on to Q&A with participants. And I can see we've had quite a few come in on the Zoom Q&A box. So turning to those, but I'm going to start perhaps actually with a question that's come from Ahmad, and going back to Ellen and Angela, our first speakers. Ellen and Angela, Ahmad wonders, How did you, in your work with people-oriented design, how did you translate the patterns and features of vernacular constructions and traditions into more contemporary architectural forms and features and spaces? And he wonders particularly what was the most challenging part of that process?
Excellent question. Where do you begin, really? I mean, there's so many facets to getting a building off the ground, so many challenging points to it. I think really, you know, there's a variety of constraints that we have in getting a building off the ground that is a new building in Australia that is to do with codes, but we also very much look to climate as well. We live in a cyclonic region. We have we're in a tropical environment, so it comes with all of those constraints. But really, it's working with the First Nations groups that drive the project from the beginning. So they will set a brief. Our client will set a brief, and we will follow along those lines. But what do you think, Angela?
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess the other thing that comes with that is that there's going to be, I guess, not going into interactions with different, I guess, assumptions, or there's a particular lens which we often fall into the trap of approaching scenarios like this, where you need to design like this, but it needs to meet this and this and this, you know, there's weaving that's used in this region, so we should incorporate that in there, or there's this particular story that's significant, so let's drive that into the design, whereas that might not be what the local community are after. So what you consider to be important to, I guess, either resemble or continue or tell the story that they want to tell. I guess the most important thing is listening to their voices and making sure that we're
foregrounding that.
Yeah.
When you have all these parameters around you, that you really are constantly drawing back to try and foreground these voices as much as possible, within all those other constraints that we deal with every day as well.
And I guess the other thing with patterns, to an important point, is not to tokenize or just copy and paste a particular symbol that's, let's say, on a shield or something, and then just stick it as a graphic on it. That can be quite disrespectful, and what those symbols can represent, or the nuances of who has the authority to be able to tell that story, or if that should even be shared. All those kind of intricacies are quite sensitive as well. So just being aware of whose story you're telling, whether you have permission to tell that story, and just approaching it with a lot of respect and sensitivity. Yeah,
making sure it's appropriate for application.
Thank you both. Two questions that we've had come in. So one from Fikera Selassie and another from Camille. And I'm actually going to just give a very quick answer to both of those. So Fikera Selassie asking, how about adaptations to current life? How can we bridge the vernacular to the current? Well, that's one of the outcomes we hope will emerge from this architecture challenge, is putting it to designers now, to architecture students, practicing architects, others, to look at those traditions, how to adapt, update, evolve, etc., working with what's there, learning from others around the world. So we hope that will come from the challenge. So no answer to be given away there, I'm afraid. And Camille, similarly, what design solutions are most appropriate in building better relationships between humans and their surrounding environment? That, again, you know, there are so many that are out there to be looked at, learned from, following the example that Manali has just shown of the close looking and learning from. And again, hoping that the architecture challenge is going to highlight some of those design solutions that exist, or that can be borrowed, tweaked, adapted, etc. So coming perhaps now to a question, I think this will suit Angela, this will also suit Manali very well. So does the incorporation of nature in architecture and interiors influence the behavior of people towards the environment and affect their relationship with the environment? So obviously building towards sort of more sustainable, more harmonious, sort of in symbiosis with nature ways of living. So I wonder, Angela, thinking about the Dra Valley, the oasis, and the environment, the harsh context there, what do you think of that question?
As I have shown before, there the environment is part of the environment and the building environment is all one. So at that point, you just have to take care of that environment and get to know it to be able to live there. So the relation is so interconnected that you cannot really take them apart. So yes, it changes completely the way they live there.
Good. Yes. No. Makes sense, Angela. And I wonder, Manali, anything to add to that one from you?
Yeah, I'll just add one thing that, as I said, architecture is a very powerful tool. So when you intervene in this relationship, you have the power to actually mend it. You have the power to actually make it stronger. And for people to realize it, it is your architecture which will speak to them and which will lead the life for them. Thank you.
Good, very concise. A question from Fred, which actually, Angela, to come back to you. What is the lifespan, Fred wonders, of the round earth structures in southern Morocco, I think particularly, and
well,
the
in my
desert
experience, it depends on maintenance. If it's really well known, this saying, but a building, if it has good boots and a good hat, then it can last forever. Now, if it's built with earth. And it's just maintenance every year, periodically, matte rendering, etc. Then it could really last really long time.
Yes, no, a good point. The good boots and good hat that applies really to architecture everywhere. And thinking about a more sustainable built future, you know, all of us needing to be living in buildings that we actually know how to repair and to maintain ourselves. That needing to be a sort of much more user-friendly, should we say, process. Thanks, Angela. Coming to one, I think, Marcel, this might be quite a good one for you. Robert wonders, Christopher Alexander's a pattern language. So if not everyone is familiar with that, you should look up Christopher Alexander and the work that he's done on genius loci, spirit of place, but also pattern language. So wondering, how important is it now in terms of creating vernacular architecture? Should Christopher Alexander's a pattern language be updated, modernized? And I thought of you because obviously you are now working on the second edition of the Encyclopedia of the Vernacular Architecture of the World, so familiar with these processes of evolving sort of written works. What do you think of pattern language?
Well, it's been a while since I read it, to be honest. I mean, I think it's always valuable to turn back to these classic studies, really, and look at what they can teach us and how they approach the study, etc. But I think we should also be aware of the context in which that was written back in the 1970s, I think. So, you know, very different world, very different context, very different setting. There's undoubtedly something to be learned from a pattern language as well. But at the same time, I also think that the world is very complex, and I'm not personally not convinced that you can capture the diversity of the world's architecture into however many 200 and something patterns, really. So we can have as many patterns as we like, and we can use that to analyze and try and understand the diversity of the world's architecture. But at the end of the day, it's a very kind of typological approach, I suppose, looking at architecture as a physical object, whereas as some of the examples have shown today, I mean, architecture is not so much about physicality, actually. It's more the life that takes place in it and the knowledge that it embodies, etc., that I think is important. So yeah, I think there's lots of classical works that we should remind ourselves of and look back at every now and then. But at the same time, I think we should also move forward.
Keep learning from and keep moving forward. Yep, no, very good. Thank you, Marcel. N. Oakley, a question actually that is for everyone. So can we come to each of you, and appropriate thinking about the COP26, the UN climate meeting coming up in November, thinking about that context. So N. Oakley is wondering, have any of you specifically considered the UNESCO Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs, in your work? And if so, how? And are there any of those goals that you found that are a particularly good fit. And I think, Angela, you showed specifically some of the SDG, the colorful wheel. So should we come perhaps to you first?
Well, yes, we are always thinking about these goals. We have them in mind all the time. I mean, but it's just a path to follow. It's something that it has been always in our minds. Really, it's just to develop sustainable communities, to find equal, to create equal opportunities to men and women, to have sustainable employment in rural areas, to develop rural areas. So it was already all in our work, and now there is a common ground to work internationally towards it. So we are really willing to do so. Yeah.
Great, thank you. And I wonder, maybe Ellen and Angela, in Queensland and in Australia more widely, how do the SDGs feature in what work you're doing?
I have to say it's not a framework that we specifically reference. At this present point in time, we have particular frameworks that we work with and goals that we've set within our practice that reference climactic goals and who we work with, how we work with them, and what these frameworks look like. Then they, I'm sure, have parallels with what's going on with the UNESCO goals, but they're not specifically those goals.
Yes, well then the purpose of goals like that being that a lot of them are quite common sense, that I think you'll be covering a lot of them without specifically looking to cover them. That's how goals like that work best.
I think it's great that they exist though. I think it's really important.
Yeah. Yes, indeed. No, thanks. Manali, how about you in your, well, your study and now your practice and your research, are the SDGs in mind?
Yeah, Harriet. So when we work with the SDGs, I think the first thing that we do is we interpret them for the project or for the context. So, and the interpretation changes always because the context is always varied. So yeah, that's what I want to say, that it is not the literal blanket answer for that. So,
yes, yeah, no, absolutely. And Marcel, I mean, thinking about the teaching that you're doing, and certainly the experience teaching that you've now had, do you find has the sort of the general global atmosphere, thinking about the second edition of the encyclopedia coming out next year, do you feel that it's generally a more receptive environment sort of within the profession, but also more widely around the world now than it perhaps was a few years ago? Do you think the SDGs have had anything to do with that?
Well, I would like to think so, but I can't kind of be that confident, to be honest. I mean, there's a lot of teaching around sustainability, obviously. A lot of that is to do with environmental issues, I think, rather than with the sustainability or the development goals more generally. I think there's always much more that can be done. I think there's a lot of tokenism. I think there's a lot of talk. There's not necessarily a lot of action, I think. So, but yeah, definitely, of course, I mean, you have to be really kind of blinkered to kind of still pretend that there's nothing that needs to be addressed really in the world in terms of poverty or climate or gender imbalance or inequality, etc., etc. But at the same time, I think we all know really that when we look at architecture and architecture education, the curricula that are being set, I mean, it's slowly changing now. The RBA is kind of introducing kind of new guidelines, etc., etc. But it has taken a good 40, 50 years really to get here, I suppose. So, so I'd like to hope that it's changing, and I'd like to hope that the next generation of students is really taking it on. And let's hope that the generation that's teaching at the moment is able to do that as well, I think, because so far I think we have a poor record.
And hoping that forward momentum that you were mentioning can sort of pick up speed, the more critical mass and awareness and understanding, get behind it. Yeah, no, thanks, Marcel. Well, maybe as we're coming towards the end, one last question, which came from Nadia in Bangladesh. And it's one that I think any of you would be very well placed to answer. So Nadia is wondering, how can a community be made aware of the consequences right now of sort of the phenomenon where a main concern is to build a house with durable, readily available potentially mass-produced materials using a common construction method that's probably legally acceptable and designated to be safe, but that, you know, that desire to build that house, durable, readily available, quick, easy, with methods that are around and commonplace now, where that in turn is sort of dismissing the values of traditional houses. So it's a very good question, Nadia. And again, sort of much of what the architecture challenge is about is trying to seek the answers, answers plural, definitely, to that question. But I wonder, perhaps, as I know it's getting very late, maybe for Ellen and Angela, anything you'd add maybe to that one first, just where the sort of possibly the right way from the sustainability, sort of keeping tradition alive perspective, not aligning necessarily with the needs of the person, the potential inhabitant, to have a structure, a home, a house speedily. Has that come up for you in your work?
Yeah, I might start off on this one. So just in terms of what I've observed from my work in the Pacific Islands in resilient climatic responsive architecture, and I guess that is very much what's happening over there. There's this, I guess the local aspiration is to have a masonry concrete block house with a corrugated sheared roof on a slab on ground, and so weaving construction and woven walls and that kind of thing very much fading out and becoming a thing of the past, and a thing that's been knowledge that's been lost. But I guess examples of how architects have tried to kind of navigate through this problem is looking at I guess local construction methods and how that can be incorporated into I guess new designs and new solutions, but keeping I guess sourcing local materials is still important, and also designing and detailing construction in a way that can be accessible and built by local people as well. So keeping in mind who you're building for, who's going to be building it, and what materials are available. And yeah, that's maybe a good way to start.
Yeah, no, I think that's an excellent response.
Yeah, good. Well, I think with that, we'll come to some of the other speakers to answer that. But Ellen and Angela, thank you very much. We're going to excuse you both because it's 1:30 in the morning.
So
and please sleep well. And thank you for joining.
Everyone.
Thank you both. Angela, I wonder the same questions that have been come up, I'm sure, in conversation with local communities you've been learning from, working with in the Mohammed Oasis. What thoughts from you?
Sure. It's a common question, yes. And what we have approached, I mean, how we have approached it is giving the opportunity to young men and women to learn the traditional crafts and the traditional construction techniques, so they can pass it on and also learn and appreciate the value and the lessons that this type of architecture can teach. And so if then they decide to live in one place or another, they are of course free to do so, but with not knowing what they are losing or what they are gaining if they do so. And I think it's a really important part to educate and to pass on all that knowledge that if we do not share is going to just be forgotten.
Yes, no, good answer. And Manali, in the context in India, and I know you've done research in lots of other countries around the world too, but what would you add to that question? What have you seen?
Yeah, Harriet, I think for me, the learning is that it has to be a dialogue. You can never say that you are right or they need to learn something, or you can never even give up. So it is a teamwork. When you are working together, you understand them. Sometimes the aspirations are also right in place. Sometimes they are really facing difficulty and you get to solve it somehow, or you get to help them solve it. So I believe it is a teamwork, and when you have that sort of a dialogue right in place, together you will come up with a solution that is derived from the traditional, but is not stuck up in past where they find difficulty to live in. So
yes, Again, that forward momentum. Thank you, Manali. Having said that was the last question, there's such a good one that's come from Jamila for Marcel specifically. So we'll finish with that one, in fact, which is, Marcel, have you ever come across any vernacular built environment anywhere in the world that was not particularly suited, either climatically or culturally?
Well, yes, quite a lot. I mean, I don't know whether that's the question that is or the answer that is expected, but yes, I think. I mean, obviously there are lots of examples of vernacular architecture, or what we call vernacular architecture, where we can say this is a great environmental fit. This works for the group of people that live there at that particular moment in time. But I think if you look around the world now, and also in the past, at some of the architecture that we call vernacular, there's a lot of problems around it. I mean, first of all, of course, there's the question of cultural appropriate to whom. So obviously there are beautiful examples of cultures where there are lovely traditional vernacular houses that embody meanings and kind of really provide a good, comfortable living for a particular section of the community. And there may be other people who actually live in architecture that we might not necessarily appreciate for being such beautiful traditions. They're actually, very poor and very poorly maintained, and maybe not very environmentally appropriate, and not necessarily pleasant to live in. Overcrowding was a very common feature of many traditional forms of architecture, I think. Climatically inappropriate as well. I think no architecture is always perfectly sustainable, because sustainability in that sense doesn't exist. So climate changes and houses exist, and they may be perfectly well adapted when they're built, and they might no longer be that after 20 years or after 3 generations as climate changes or cultural needs change. We've got lots of examples of respiratory diseases among little children because of open fireplaces in beautiful traditional houses with beautiful thatched roofs, but nonetheless not necessarily that healthy. So wouldn't definitely not meet the sustainability goals. So yeah, I think so. Yeah, I think as in any architecture, there's good architecture, there's bad architecture. Some architecture is good the moment it's designed, and is no longer good after a few years or a few generations. Sometimes it's the other way around. Cultures change, times changes, climates change, as we know. So yeah, I think there are good examples, there are bad examples. And I think that is one of the lessons to be learned from vernacular architecture, and also with this concept of traditional architecture. There are good traditions, there are bad traditions, there are traditions that we like to maintain. There are traditions that we probably rather get rid of, really, and no longer fit for purpose in this day and age. So yeah, that's my answer, I think.
A very good answer. I think whether or not it was what Jamila was expecting, a very good answer. And you can all look forward to the second edition of the encyclopedia, which will hopefully be out next year. Thank you very much. So a few words now just to draw the session to a close, rather. So first to thank our speakers very, very much. So Angela and Ellen, Angela from Terrachidia, Manly and Marcel, and all of you as participants, thanks very much for joining us, but also a big thanks to Juliet Butler and to Janos Polikoniadis, who have helped to make all of this work as well as it has. So you can catch up with the recording of this session and also of the first session if you missed it from the 30th of July. And do share the links to those when they come around to you with anyone in your network who you think might be interested in this initiative. So we hope that this session has given all of you the confidence and also the incentive to take on the architecture challenge, along with a sense of some of the next steps perhaps towards positive change. There are 5 more webinars in the series to come. The third is going to be on the 30th of September, with speakers tackling some of the difficult questions that this initiative raises, which I alluded to back at the beginning. So you can register on the challenge website, and we have got that at a slightly expanded view up now on the screen. So it's challenge.intbau.org. That's where you'll find to sign up to the challenge, to be kept up to date with everything that's happening. Come to the next webinars and you can earn a certificate if you attend at least 4. I saw a message in the chat just now of looking for CPD certificate, not until you've attended 4, and 4 need to have taken place before you can earn it. So do come along to the next in the series. And beyond that, really just thanks once again to all our speakers. Thanks to all of you for joining, and we'll see you for the next session at the end of September.
Thank you.